At 61, after 34 years of marriage, Maren Tolliver was sleeping in her car. Her husband was dead. The house was gone to the bank. She had $43.12 to her name, and the only thing left in the whole world that still carried her name was 160 acres of dead Dust Bowl ground in the Oklahoma Panhandle. A lawyer told her it wasn't worth the back taxes owed against it. Everyone told her to let the county take it. She didn't, and the neighbors laughed at the way she worked it. A man in a clean white truck offered her cash to walk away, and when she said no, he came to take it from her by force of law. But behind a false panel in the wall of a house her grandfather had walked out of 30 years before and never returned to, Maren found a rusted tobacco tin. Inside it were 4 notebooks, $190 in soft old bills, and a secret a dead man had spent a lifetime burying. A secret about how to stop an entire country from blowing away. And a quiet ledger of every neighbor he had ever saved. What that old woman did with it would humble 4 counties. And it began with a single strip of grass she refused to plow. If you have ever been written off as too old, too poor, or too far gone to matter, stay with this story to the end. And subscribe now, because what Maren Tolliver pulled out of that rusted tin will change the way you think about everything you have ever been told to throw away. Now, here is how it happened. The afternoon Maren Tolliver signed away the last of her husband's debts, the woman behind the bank desk in Liberal, Kansas, slid a receipt across the counter that came to $43.12. It was the fee to close an account that had nothing left in it. Maren was 61 years old. She had been a wife for 34 of those years, and now she stood in a carpeted lobby that smelled of toner and burnt coffee, holding a slip of paper that said, in effect, that she owned nothing, owed nothing, and belonged nowhere. The teller was kind about it. She had a soft voice and a way of not quite meeting Maren's eyes. The way people look slightly past you when they are sorry for you and don't know how to say it. That should settle everything, the young woman said. Maren folded the receipt into quarters and put it in her coat pocket beside her car keys. She thanked her. She had been raised to thank people, even when the news was bad. Cole Tolliver had died 18 months earlier, in a hospital bed in Wichita, of a heart that had quietly failed him over the course of a single hard winter. He had been a good man in most of the ways that mattered, and a careless one in the ways that don't show until later. He had signed a second mortgage on their house to cover a year when the trucking work dried up, and he had never told her the half of what he carried, and when he was gone, the paper came due all at once. The medical bills came first, then the bank. The house on Pawnee Street, the one with the porch swing Cole, had hung himself the summer Reagan left office, sold at auction for less than they owed on it. Maren had stood across the road and watched a man she'd never met hammer a sign into her front yard. She did not cry. She had done her crying in the hospital, all of it, and there didn't seem to be any left. What she had now fit into a 1998 Buick LeSabre with 187,000 miles on the odometer and a dent in the rear quarter panel from a deer she'd hit outside Plains 3 years back. In the trunk were 2 suitcases, a box of photographs, Cole's Good Sunday hat, and a cast-iron skillet that had been her mother's. On the back seat was a sleeping bag and a pillow that still smelled faintly of the laundry soap she'd used for 30 years. She had been sleeping in the car for 11 days, in church lots and behind a truck stop off Highway 54, washing in gas station bathrooms, telling no one. She had a sister in Tulsa who would have taken her in, but Maren had not called her. There are kinds of help that cost more than they give, and Maren had spent her whole life paying her own way, and she was not ready to stop, even now, even with nowhere to go. The marriage had not been a bad one, which was the part that was hardest to carry. Cole had loved her in his quiet, undemonstrative way, and they had built a life that looked, from the road, like every other life on Pawnee Street, not happy exactly, nor unhappy but settled, the way a house settles onto its foundation, the small cracks opening so Slee see them. What she had not known, in all those years of settling, was the second mortgage, and the cards, and the slow, quiet drowning he had done alone rather than tell her. He had carried it by himself all the way to a hospital bed in Wichita, and when his heart let go of it, the debt fell on her, the way a load falls on whoever is standing nearest when the strap breaks. She did not hate him for it. She had tried in the 11 days in the car and found she could not. She only wished, with an ache that woke her in the dark, that he had let her help carry it while there was still time. That was the lesson the months of poverty ground into her, the one she did not yet know she would spend the rest of her life passing on. that letting people help you is its own kind of courage, and a burden kept secret crushes two people instead of one. If you have ever watched the bottom fall out of a life you thought was solid ground, take a moment to subscribe to this channel. Stories like this one are a quiet reminder that the things people throw away are not always the things without worth. The lawyer who had handled what little there was to handle was a man named Pell in Boise City, 3 hours southwest across the dead flat top of the Oklahoma Panhandle. He had called her twice and left messages she had been too tired to answer. On the 12th day, sitting in the Buick in a Walmart parking lot with the engine off to save gas and the wind rocking the car on its springs, she finally called him back. "Mrs. Tolliver," he said, "I'm glad you got my message. There's a small matter of your grandfather's estate." Marin held the phone against her ear and watched a plastic bag cartwheel across the empty lot. Her grandfather had been dead for more than 30 years. Walt Coyle, Pell said when she didn't answer. "Your mother's father. He left you a quarter section out in Cimarron County. 160 acres. It's been sitting in probate limbo a long time on account of nobody could find an heir who'd claim it. You're the last of the line that's still living." Marin remembered her grandfather only in pieces. A big, quiet man with hands like cured leather and a habit of going still before he spoke, the way some men do who have learned that words spent too freely are words wasted. She remembered the smell of him, dust and sweat, and the particular sweetness of cottonwood sap. She remembered a windmill turning against a hard blue sky. She had not been to his land since she was a girl of 9, and she had assumed, the way you assume things about the dead, that it had passed to someone, somewhere, long ago. "What's it worth?" she asked. There was a pause on the line, and in that pause she heard everything Pell was too polite to say plainly. "Mrs. Tolliver, I'll be straight with you. That ground's been blowing away since the 30s. It's dry land, no irrigation, no oil, no improvements to speak of, an old house that's likely not fit to stand in. And there's back taxes owed on it. $3,142 and some change. Honestly, the taxes are about all it's worth. Most folks in your position would let the county take it." He said it gently. He was telling her she'd inherited a debt with some dirt attached. She should have felt nothing. She had nothing left to feel things with, or so she'd thought. But sitting there in the rocking car with the wind in her ears, Marin felt something turn over in her chest, slow and unexpected, like a key finding a lock it had not been cut for. 160 acres? A place, even a ruined one, even a poisoned chalice. It was more than she'd had that morning. "I'll come look at it," she said. The drive west out of Boise City was a drive into emptiness. The land flattened until the horizon was a single ruled line, the sky enormous above it, the color of washed denim. Wheat stubble, gone gray, ran out to the edge of sight. The wind never stopped. It came out of the southwest in a steady press that bent the dry grass all one way and hummed against the Buick's windows, and every so often a brown veil would lift off a bare field and drift across the road, and Marin would lose the world for a moment in a haze of moving dirt. She passed a town called Keys that was mostly a grain elevator and a closed cafe. She passed a dead farmstead, then another. The houses caved in on themselves, the barns sway back in gray. This was Cimarron County, the very corner of the Dust Bowl, the place the old photographs came from, the black blizzards, and the buried fences and the families on the road with everything they owned strapped to a truck. Marin understood, looking at it, why the lawyer had told her to let the county take the land. It looked like a country that had already given up. Pell had drawn her a map on the back of an envelope. She turned off the highway onto a section-line road of packed dirt and washboard gravel, drove 4.5 miles by the odometer, and came to a cattle guard and a leaning steel gate, and beyond the gate, set back against the only thing on that whole flat plain that rose above the horizon, a long dark row of trees. She stopped the car. She had expected trees out here, where the wind scoured everything and the rain came 11 inches. In a good year, trees were a kind of impossibility, and yet there they stood, a single uneven line of them running north and south for what looked like a quarter mile. Cottonwoods, mostly, tall and battered, half of them dead and silver, the living ones leafing out late and thin. Set in front of them a denser, lower hedge of something dark and thorny. And tucked into the lee of all of it, the way a small animal tucks into the lee of a stone, a low house of weathered board, and a windmill whose blades turned slow and complaining in the wind. If you've made it this far, hit that like button, because what Marin found behind that line of trees is the heart of everything that follows. She got out of the car. The wind took her hair and her breath both. The cold of it was a dry cold, a scouring cold, nothing like the wet cold of a Kansas winter. She walked through the gate and up the rutted track toward the house, and the dust she kicked up went sideways instead of settling. The house was smaller than the houses of her memory, a four-room box with a tin roof, gone the color of an old nickel, and a porch sagging on the south end. The windows were intact, which surprised her. Most abandoned houses she'd passed had blind black holes for eyes. These had glass, dust-filmed and cracked in one corner but whole. Somebody had cared for this place longer than anyone had any reason to. The door was held shut by a hasp and a padlock so frosted it had nearly become a piece of orange iron. Pell had given her a key in a manila envelope, and when she fitted in and worked it, the lock gave with a gritty reluctance, like something waking up that had been a long time asleep. Inside, the air was still and close and smelled of dust and cold ash, and under that something older and not unpleasant, the smell of dry wood that has held the warmth of many fires. The front room had a cook stove, a plank table, 2 chairs, and a daybed with a mattress gone to ticking and mousework. The walls were papered with newspaper, layer on layer, the way poor people insulated against the wind in the hard years, and the topmost layer she could still read in places. "Wheat prices fall again," said one column. There was a calendar on the wall from 1991 turned to October, the month her grandfather had died. A coffee cup sat on the table, the dregs in it gone to a black scale. His reading glasses, the wire kind, sat folded beside it. Marin stood in the doorway and did not go in for a long moment. She had walked into the room a man had walked out of half a lifetime ago and never come back to, and the air of it had been holding its breath ever since. She slept that first night in the Buick, parked in the lee of the house, where the wind couldn't get a full grip on it, because the house frightened her a little in a way she could not have explained. But in the morning the wind had laid down to a whisper, and the sun came up red and enormous over the stubble, and Marin made coffee on a camp stove on the sagging porch and looked out at the 160 acres she now owned, and made a decision that surprised her as much as it would have surprised anyone who knew her. She was not going to let the county take it. She did not have $3,000. She did not have 300. She had no plan and no prospects, and no earthly reason to believe she could keep it. But she had a place, for the first time in 18 months, and she had learned in those months that a place was not nothing. A place was the thing everything else grew from. The next weeks were the hardest physical work Marin had done in her life, and she was no stranger to work. She cleaned the house room by room, hauling the ruined mattress out to burn, sweeping decades of grit out the door, scrubbing the windows with vinegar and newspaper until the light came through clean. She found that the windmill still pumped after she'd greased the works and freed the rusted vane, and that the water it brought up was cold and hard, good. She found a garden plot behind the house, gone entirely to weeds and blow dirt, ringed by a fence of cedar posts her grandfather must have set, and she began with a spade and a hoe and her own 2 hands to bring it back. She had $41 to her name. She bought seed potatoes and bean seed and a sack of pinto beans for eating at the store in Keys, and a woman there, watching her count out coins from a thin handful, nodded at the broken sewing machine sitting behind the counter. "You any good with your hands?" the woman asked. "I'm better with my hands than with about anything else," Marin said. She had the machine running in 20 minutes flat, a bent timing arm and a thread of lint in the bobbin race. Because there was nothing mechanical her father hadn't taught her to take apart. The woman watched her work and said, "You're Walt Coyle's people, aren't you? You've got his way of going quiet over a thing till you've figured it." She sent Marin home with a setting hen and a dozen fertile eggs and would not take a dime for them. Word travels in an empty country. By the end of the first month, 3 different ranch families up and down that sectionland road knew that the Coyle place had somebody living on it again, and that the somebody was an old woman who could fix things. There were days that first month when Marin did not think she would last. The wind was a thing she had not reckoned with, a presence that never left, that pressed against the house all night, and was waiting for her on the porch every morning, that dried her lips to cracking and pulled the moisture out of everything and worked, slow and patient and ceaseless, at the edges of her resolve. She would wake before light in the cold house and lie under the sleeping bag she'd carried in from the Buick and listen to it work the loose tin on the roof, a steady metallic worrying. And she would think, with a clarity that frightened her, that she was an old woman alone on a dead farm in the emptiest country in America, and that no one in the world knew or much cared whether she rose from that bed or not. Then the light would come up red over the stubble, and she would rise anyway. She rose anyway every morning, because rising was the only thing she had left that was entirely hers. She found that the work itself was a kind of mercy. There is a thing that happens to grief when it is given hard physical labor to do, the way it sinks down out of the front of the mind and settles into the muscles, where it can be spent. Maren spent it. She cleared the garden plot a square yard at a time, breaking the crust of blow dirt with a spade, picking the cedar roots and the bindweed out by hand until her knuckles cracked and bled in the dry air. She greased the windmill works hanging 20 feet up in a swaying wooden tower in a 30-mile wind, because there was no one else to do it, and when the vane finally swung free and the sucker rod began its slow chug, and the first cold water came spilling out brown and then running clear, Maren stood with her hand in it and felt something close to joy, the first she had felt in 18 months. She had brought water out of the ground with her own 2 hands. It seemed, just then, like the largest thing a person could do. They were not unkind to her, the neighbors, but they did not expect anything of her, either. The nearest was a man named Dwight Ferris, who ran cattle and dryland wheat on the adjoining section to the south, a heavy-set, sun-creased man in his 50s, who came by on a Sunday in his truck to see what was going on. He stood in her yard with his hands in his back pockets and looked at the house and the trees and her little garden the way man looks at a thing he has already made up his mind about. Walt Coyle's granddaughter, he said. Well, he'd be glad somebody's here, I expect. He looked out at the unplowed quarter, the natives' grass that had crept back over most of it in the decades since anyone had worked it, the dark line of the shelter belt. You aim to farm it? He asked, and there was something in the way he asked it that told Maren the only sensible answer was no. I don't know yet, she said. Dwight nodded as if she'd confirmed something. It's hard country, he said, harder than it looks, and it looks hard. My granddad and your granddad came up together in the dirty 30s. Most everybody else around here pulled out. The smart ones did anyway. He said it without meanness. He climbed back in his truck. You need anything, holler, he said, and drove off, and the dust of him hung in the air a long time after he was gone. If you've ever had someone decide what you're capable of before you've said a word, you already know the particular quiet of that moment. Stay with Maren, because she was about to find something that changed how she understood every person who'd ever underestimated her. It was in the 2nd month, on a day too windy to work outside, that Maren found the tin. She had been clearing out a low cabinet built into the wall beside the cook stove, a place where her grandfather had kept odds and ends, balls of twine, a box of fuses, a jar of buttons. At the very back, behind a false panel of board she only found because it sounded hollow when she knocked it, was a flat tin box that had once held tobacco, sealed with a strip of cloth tape gone brittle with age. Inside the tin were 3 things. A bundle of paper money, soft as cloth, that turned out to be $190 in old bills, which Maren held in her 2 hands and did not for a moment breathe. She had $41 to her name and a tax bill the size of a year's wages hanging over her head, and here was a dead man reaching out of his tin to press $190 into her palm, and the strangeness of it, the tenderness of it, undid her there at the cook stove, in a way the bank and the auction and the 11 days in the car had not. She had not wept since the hospital. She wept now, holding the soft old bills. For a grandfather she barely remembered who had hidden his small savings behind a false panel, and somehow, across 30 years and the whole width of death, had known that someone would come who needed it. Then she wiped her face on her sleeve, because there was work to do, and set the money aside. A folded document with a county seal which she set aside to read later. And wrapped in oilcloth, 4 notebooks, the cardboard-covered kind, their pages crammed edge to edge in a small, square, patient hand. She read the notebooks, by lamplight that night, and the next night, and the night after that, until she had read them all the way through, and started again, at the beginning. They were her grandfather's, kept across nearly 60 years, from 1933 to 1991. They were not a diary, exactly, though there was a man's life in them. They were a record of the land. Walt Coyle had set down, year by year, what he planted and what came up and what blew away. He had drawn diagrams, careful as an engineer's, of where the wind came from and what it did, of how the dust moved across a bare field and where it dropped. And running through all of it, like a creek through a dry country, was an idea so simple Maren did not at first understand that it was the whole secret, the thing the entire county had spent 90 years failing to learn. Never let the ground go naked. He had written it in the first notebook, in 1934, the worst year, the year the sky turned black at noon and the cattle smothered standing up, and the children got dust pneumonia. And he had written it again and again across 40 years, until it stopped being a sentence and became a faith. The dust does not blow off a field that is covered. It blows off a field that is bare. Everyone he knew had plowed their ground black and clean every fall, because that was how their fathers had farmed it back in Ohio and Missouri, where the rain fell soft and steady, and out here on the high, dry plains that clean black ground had simply lifted up in the wind and flown away. All of it, the topsoil that took 10,000 years to make, gone east, in a single afternoon to fall as red snow on the streets of Washington. Walt had watched it happen, and Walt, alone among his neighbors, or nearly alone, had stopped. He had left his stubble standing through the winter to hold the soil. He had sown rye and clover to cover the ground when the wheat came off, a living blanket that the wind could not strip. He had taken his worst, most blow-prone ground, the sandy quarter along the old creek channel, out of the plow entirely and let the native buffalo grass and grandma come back, because grass holds, he wrote, the way nothing a man plants can hold. And he had planted the trees, the shelter belt. Marin had wondered at it, the long dark line of cottonwoods and the thorny hedge in front, and now she understood it. In 1937, the government had come through the plains with a project to plant trees in long rows across the wind, 100 million of them from Texas to the Dakotas, a green wall to break the killing wind and hold the dirt. Most farmers had taken the free trees and let them die, too busy or too discouraged to carry water to a seedling in a drought. Walt had not. He had carried water by the bucketful, in the worst years of his life, to keep those trees alive, because he had done the figuring and he knew what a row of living trees would do. A windbreak does not stop the wind, he wrote. It is not a wall, it is a comb. It takes the killing force out of the wind for a long way downwind, and in the calm it leaves, the dust settles and the snow piles and the moisture stays and the ground in its shelter stays put. Behind those trees, Walt's land had held while his neighbors blew away. The diagrams showed it, the careful arrows, the zones of shelter measured out in his small hand. He had built himself an island in a country that was washing out to sea. If you are still here, subscribe before you go any further, because the part of the story that comes next is the part that explains why a man would spend 40 years saving a land that everyone else had given up on. There was more in the notebooks than the soil and the trees, though it took Marin a second and third reading to see it. There was weather, set down with the patience of a man, for whom weather was the difference between living and dying. The rain of 41, an inch and 6/10 in one June night, the most in 4 years, and Walt's small careful note beside it, the cover held it. The bare fields to the west lost it all to runoff in an hour. There was a drawing of a single wheat plant grown in covered ground beside one grown in bare, the roots of the first reaching down twice as far, and underneath it the line. The ground that is fed holds water like a sponge. The ground that is worked to dust sheds it like a roof. There were prices, the heartbreak of the 30s laid out in figures. Wheat at 33 cents the bushel the year it cost more than that to grow it, and Walt's refusal to plow up his grass to trace a crop that would not pay, a refusal that his neighbors had taken for laziness, and that had in the end been the only thing that saved his farm. He had been a stubborn man, Marin understood, in the deep way that the high plains rewards and almost never recognizes in time. He had been right, and being right had made him strange to the people around him, and he had carried that strangeness for 40 years without complaint and set it all down in a square, patient hand so that it would not be lost. It was the third notebook that broke Marin's heart and remade it. Folded into the back of it were lists. Names down the left side, and beside each name in Walt's square hand, an account, not of money owed, of things given. Seed wheat, 10 bushel to the Hudson, spring of 36, do not collect. Milk to the Renner children all that winter. The Vale family, 4 months in the front room, and the barn loft, the year the dust took their place, fed at my table, asked nothing. There were dozens of names across the decades, and the same instruction came after the worst of them, in the same patient hand. Do not collect. Walt Coyle, who had so little that he kept his savings sealed in a tobacco tin behind a false panel, had spent the hard years of his life quietly keeping his neighbors alive, and had kept a careful record of it, not so that he could be repaid, but Marin slowly understood, so that he would not forget them, so that the giving would be real to him, a thing accounted for. The longest entry was for the Vales. Walt had written it out in something closer to plain speech than the rest, as though the weight of it had pushed him past his usual shorthand. The Vale place blew out entire in the spring of 37, he wrote. Roof gone, well filled with sand, the children coughing the dust cough that killed the Renner baby 2 doors down. Cyrus Vale came to my gate too proud to ask, and I did not make him ask. I told him the front room was standing empty, which was a lie, and that the barn loft was warm, which was nearly true, and that I could use the help with the trees, which was the only true thing, I said. They stayed 4 months. Mrs. Vale cooked and the children carried water to the seedlings, and Cyrus and I set the last of the windbreak together in a wind that would take the skin off your face. When they left in the fall, they tried to pay me, and I would not have it. A man does not charge another man for being alive. There was no signature under it, no flourish. Walt had not written it to be admired. He had written it to remember, and Marin, reading it 60-odd years later in the same front room where the Vale children had slept, felt the whole long reach of one good man's life close around her like a hand. Marin sat with that a long time. She thought about her own 18 months, the church lots and the gas station bathrooms, the 11 days in the Buick, the not calling of her sister. She thought about how she had taken her own poverty and made of it a thing to be ashamed of, a thing to hide. And here was a man who had been poorer than she would ever be, in a country harder than any she would ever live in, who had taken what little he had and given half of it away, and kept the books on his own kindness so that it would not be lost. The land had not made Walt Coyle rich, but Walt Coyle had made the land into something that outlasted him, and the books proved he had done the same with people. Marin did not know it yet, but she had just inherited the only fortune that had ever mattered out here, and it was about to be tested in exactly the way her grandfather's had been. She made her decision that winter. She would farm the quarter the way Walt had farmed it. She had no money for machinery and no need of it, because Walt's way did not require breaking the ground every year. She would leave the native grass on the worst ground. She would sow the croppable acres to wheat in the old way and never plow them bare, leaving the stubble standing all winter long, sowing a cover of rye behind the harvest to keep the ground clothed. She would tend the shelter belt, water the young trees, fill the gaps in the line where the old cottonwoods had died, because she had found in the 4th notebook Walt's note on exactly how to start a cottonwood from a cutting, push a green pole into the wet spring ground and walk away, and it will root. And she would do all of it. That first year, in front of an audience of neighbors who had already decided she was a sentimental old woman playing at a farm she did not understand. The mockery, when it came, was gentle, which was almost worse. In the spring, when every other field up and down the section line was being worked black and clean for the new crop, Marin left her stubble standing and sowed her cover and did not plow. Dwight Ferris drove past on his tractor and lifted 2 fingers off the wheel in the country wave. And she could see him looking at her unworked ground, and she could see him deciding not to say anything. A younger man, Ferris's nephew Cody, was not so restrained. He pulled up at her gate one afternoon, leaned out his truck window, and said, grinning, "You know you're supposed to plow it before you plant it, right? Ground's gonna choke up in all that trash." Trash. That was what they called the stubble, the standing stems, the cover, all the living and dead material that Walt's whole life had been about keeping on the ground. "My grandfather called it armor," Marin said. Cody laughed, not unkindly, and drove off. She went back to setting cottonwood poles along the gap in the shelter belt, pushing each one 1.5 feet into the wet spring earth the way the notebook said, and walking away and trusting a dead man she had met 4 times. If you've ever trusted a voice that everyone around you couldn't hear, you'll understand what carried Marin through that spring. And what was coming for the high plains that summer would prove every word of it. The old folks came that summer, not all at once, but one at a time, the way people come in an empty country when they have something to say and no easy way to say it. The first was a woman named Ada Renner, 91 years old, brought out by her granddaughter in a sedan that struggled on the washboard road. Marin helped her up onto the porch and gave her coffee, and the old woman sat looking out at the shelter belt for a long time before she spoke. "I was 6 years old the winter your grandfather brought us milk," she finally said. 1936, my daddy's cows had all died. We'd have starved or near it. Walt come every other morning before light, left a can on the step, never knocked, never said a word about it. All my life I've been wanting to thank that man, and there wasn't anybody to thank. She had heard, the way the country hears, that Walt's granddaughter was living on the place. She had made her granddaughter drive her 40 miles to sit on the porch where it had happened. Marin did not tell her that, first day, about the notebook, about the line that said milk to the Renner children, all that winter, do not collect. She brought it out on the second visit, and she read it aloud, and the two of them sat on the porch and wept, an old woman and an older one, over a kindness that had waited half a century to be spoken. After Ada, others came. An old man named Hudson, whose father had gotten the 10 bushels of seed wheat, drove out one Saturday in a truck older than he was. He was 91, bent nearly double, and he would not sit, but stood in the yard, leaning on a cane and looking at the shelter belt with eyes gone milky at the edges. My daddy planted his 37 crop with your granddad's seed, he said. Borrowed seed, we called it, but Walt never did ask for it back, not the seed and not what it grew into. We'd have lost the place that year. I was a boy. I remember my daddy crying at the supper table, which I never saw before nor since, because a man 2 miles off had kept us on our land and wouldn't take a thing for it. He worked his jaw a moment, the way the very old do when a feeling comes up that the body is too tired to fully make. I always meant to do something for Walt. Time gets away. Then he was gone, and there wasn't anybody to do it for. Marin brought him the notebook and showed him the line, seed wheat, 10 bushel, to the Hudsons, spring of 36, do not collect, and the old man put his thumb on the page where his family's name was written and stood like that a long while, not speaking, and Marin let him, because she had learned from the notebooks that you let people arrive at a thing in their own time. A woman whose mother had been a Vale came, one of the family Walt had sheltered 4 months in his front room, and Marin read her the long entry, the front room standing empty, which was a lie, and the barn loft, which was nearly true. And the woman, who was 68 and had thought she knew the whole of her family's story, learned that night that she did not, that the worst season of her people's lives had been survived on the quiet mercy of a man whose name she had heard 100 times and never understood. They came to see the place and to tell Marin what her grandfather had done, and to find, every one of them, that Marin already knew, that it was written down, that Walt had kept the account not against them but for them, a record that they had mattered. The land that Pell the lawyer had called worth nothing but its back taxes turned out to be the keystone of a memory that ran through 40 miles of empty country, holding a whole scattered community to a man who had been dead for 30 years. Marin, who had arrived with nothing and belonging nowhere, found herself, by the end of that summer, woven into a place more deeply than she had ever been woven into the house on Pawnee Street, where she had lived for 30 years. She had a place now. She was beginning to understand a people. She also had wheat coming up clean and green through the standing stubble, and a shelter belt greening along its whole length, and the canoe cotton poles she had set in the spring breaking into leaf, every one of them rooted just as the notebook said they would. She had cottonwood poles taking root. And she had, though she did not know it yet, drawn the attention of the one kind of man her grandfather's whole life had been a warning against. He came in a clean white truck on a hot, still morning in July, a man of about 45 in pressed jeans and a starched shirt with a soft handshake and a hard measuring way of looking at things. His name was Garrett Dunn, and he handed Marin a card that said he was an acquisition manager for a company called Caprock Land and Water out of Amarillo. He admired her shelter belt. He admired her little garden. He sat at her plank table and drank her coffee and got to the point with the practiced ease of a man who had done this in 100 kitchens. Mrs. Tolliver, I'll be honest with you, because you strike me as a woman who appreciates honesty. This is hard ground to make a living on. You're carrying back taxes on it. My company buys ground out here and we're prepared to make you a fair offer, cash, clean, no fuss. You walk away with money in your pocket instead of a tax bill on your back. He named a figure. It was more money than Marin had seen in 18 months. He watched her face when he said it, looking for the relief, the gratitude, the yes. He did not find them. Marin had spent 2 months reading the notebooks of a man who had been offered, in his own way, the same trade a dozen times across 40 years, the chance to sell out and walk away and let the wind have it, and who had said no every time. She knew, sitting across the table from Garrett Dunn's soft handshake and hard eyes, what her grandfather would have wanted to know. Why? She asked. Mr. Pell told me this ground isn't worth its taxes, so why would your company want it? For just a moment, something moved behind Dunn's pleasant face, the small irritation of a man who has been asked the one question he prefers not to answer. We take a long view, he said smoothly. We aggregate acreage. Sometimes the value's in the assembly, not the parcel. He smiled. You let me worry about why, Mrs. Tolliver. You worry about your tax bill. Stay with this, because what Garrett Dunn was hiding under that smile is the difference between everything Walt Coyle built and everything that men like Dunn have always come to take. Marin did not sell. She told Dunn she'd think about it, because that was the polite thing and she was a polite woman, but she had no intention of thinking about it. And Dunn knew it, and the pleasantness went out of his goodbye. He came back twice more. The second time he raised the figure and brought a folder of papers and spread them on her plank table, glossy aerial photographs of her quarter with lines drawn on them. And he talked about market timing and the kindness of a clean exit, and the foolishness of an old woman fighting a losing country alone. He was good at it. He had the gift of making the thing he wanted sound like the thing you needed, and Marin, who was tired and poor and 61 years old, felt the pull of it, felt how easy it would be to take the money and the room in town and the end of the worry. The third time he came, he did not raise the figure. He let a small hardness show. You should understand, Mrs. Tolliver, that there are taxes owed on this place, and ways those things resolve themselves whether you sell or not. I'd hate to see you lose it for nothing, when you could have walked away with something. Marin looked at him a long moment across the table where her grandfather had sat. Mr. Dunn, she said, I spent 11 days sleeping in my car before I came to this land. I've already lost everything a person can lose and live. You think a tax bill is going to scare me off a place that's the only thing standing between me and the ditch? She stood, which meant the visit was over. You can show yourself out. It was a threat dressed as a courtesy, and Marin heard clearly, and looked. She sat at the table where her grandfather had sat and looked at the glossy photographs Dunn had left behind, the lines drawn across her land like a butcher's dagger. And she just understood that the fight had already begun, and that she was the only one of the two of them who did not yet have her weapon. So she went and found it. She sat with the folded county document she had found in the tobacco tin and had not yet understood, and read it for the first time with real attention. It was a tax receipt, an old one, stamped and sealed by the Cimarron County Treasurer, dated 1968, and clipped to it was a letter in Walt's hand addressed to no one or to whoever would someday need it. To whoever holds this land after me, it began. The county will tell you more taxes are owed on this place than truly are. In 1962, the assessor doubled the rolls on this quarter by clerical error, taxing it as if it were two parcels, and I have fought them many years to correct it, and they will not. So I pay only what is truly due, and I keep every receipt, and I leave them here, because a man who farmed a thing this long knows the error will outlive him, and somebody will try to use it. Do not let them. The true tax on this ground is small. The receipts are in the tin. Marin went through the tin again, and there at the bottom, under the bills, was a thick packet of receipts she had taken for old papers. Decades of them, every one stamped paid, every one in order, the last one dated the year he died. Her grandfather had reached out of his grave to hand her the weapon she would need, before she even knew that there was a fight. The fight came quickly. Within the week, a process server she'd never seen drove out the washboard road and handed Marin a thick envelope. Caprock Land and Water had not waited for her answer. The company, she read, had purchased the delinquent tax lien on her property from the county and was moving to foreclose. The amount they claimed was owed, with penalties and interest, had swollen to $4,608. She had 30 days to redeem the lien by paying it in full, or the land would go to the lien holder. It was an old trick and a clean one, the kind that took ground from poor people all over the high plains, perfectly legal, perfectly quiet, a man in a clean truck and a number on a piece of paper, and at the end of it your land belonged to somebody else and you never even saw it happen. Dunn had not been able to buy her out, so he had moved to take it, and he had bet, the way such men always bet, that an old widow with $40 and no lawyer would simply give up. He had not counted on the tin. He had not counted on a man, dead 30 years, who had fought the same county over the same inflated assessment for decades and kept every receipt. And he had not counted on the thing that Marin had, and that Dunn, who measured everything in dollars, could not even see, and so could not value, and so had no defense against. Marin had a community now, and that community had a memory, and at the center of that memory was a tin box full of proof. If you've made it all the way here, you already know which way the wind is about to turn. Hit subscribe because the next part is why this story exists. She drove to Boise City the next morning with the notebooks and the tin on the seat beside her. Pell, the lawyer, looked through the receipts and the letter and the doubled assessment with the slow care of a man, finding out he had badly underestimated a client. Mrs. Tolliver, he said, If these are what they appear to be, that lien is built on a 50-year mistake. The county's been carrying this quarter on the rolls at double its true value since 1962 and stacking penalties on the half that was never owed. Caprock bought a number, not a debt. The real arrears, once we correct the assessment, are a fraction of what they're claiming. We can challenge it. But challenging it would take time and money, and the 30 days were running, and Pell was honest enough to tell her that Caprock had lawyers who would drag it out past her clock if they could. What broke it open was not the law. What broke it open was the county treasurer's office, and a woman named Lorna Vale who ran it, who was 70 years old, and the daughter of the Vale family. Walt Coyle had sheltered 4 months in his front room in the worst year of the Dust Bowl. When Marin laid the receipts on her counter, and Lorna Vale saw the name on them and saw Walt's hand, the old woman went very still, the way Marin's grandfather had gone still before he spoke. "My mother told me about this man every day of her life," she said quietly. "She said we'd have died on the road if not for Walt Coyle." She pulled the county's own records, the originals, and there it was, the 1962 double assessment, the clerical error carried forward on the rolls for half a century, plain as day to anyone who cared to look, which no one ever had, because the only person it had ever harmed was a dead man and an old woman nobody expected to fight. The county corrected its rolls back to the true value of the land. The genuine taxes owed across the legitimate years, the real low rate on near-worthless dry land, came to $311.17, and Marin paid every cent of it with $190 of her grandfather's soft old bills out of the tin and $121 she had earned, fixing sewing machines and small engines all summer for the families up and down the road. With the assessment corrected and the true arrears paid in full, there was nothing left for Caprock's lien to stand on, and the foreclosure collapsed. You cannot take a woman's land over $4,000 when the real debt was $300, and was paid the moment she learned it existed. Garrett Dunn's clean white truck did not come back out the washboard road. He had bet on a number, and the number had been a 50-year-old error, and the old woman he had counted on to give up had handed the county a packet of receipts kept by a man who had been dead since before Dunn ever learned to read a balance sheet. He had wanted the land, and Marin learned later from Pell what he had wanted it for, the thing he had not been able to value because he could not see it. Caprock had been buying every quarter section for miles, quietly assembling the ground over a strong stretch of the Ogallala to sink center pivot wells and mine the deep water for as long as it lasted, and then move on, leaving the country drier and more broken than they'd found it. Dunn had looked at Walt Coyle's land and seen only the water under it. He had never once looked at what was on top of it, and so he had never understood the one thing that was about to make Marin's 160 acres the most talked-about ground in the county. Because that was the summer the drought came back. It came the way droughts come to the high plains, not as an event but as an absence, a rain that simply did not arrive. The cover crops failed across the county. The new plowed fields cracked and crumbled to powder. And in the 3rd week of August, on a day when the temperature stood at 104 and the wind had been building out of the southwest since dawn, the sky to the west turned the color of an old bruise and began to move, and the high plains saw the thing the old people had prayed never to see again. A duster, a wall of moving dirt 1,000 feet high, rolling across the flat country at 30 miles an hour, swallowing the sun. Marin stood on her porch and watched it come. And her heart was in her throat, because for all her grandfather's notebooks and all her faith, she had never seen one, and the size of it, the animal wrongness of a sky turned to earth, took the courage out of her knees. Then it was on her. The light went out at 2 in the afternoon. The wind screamed in the windmill and flung grit against the glass like buckshot, and the air went thick and red and you could not see the trees 30 feet away. And Marin went inside and wet a cloth and held it over her face the way the notebook said to, and she sat in her grandfather's chair in the dark and the roar, and she waited. It lasted 3 hours. In the dark of it, with the house shuddering and the grit hissing against the glass and the air gone red and thick enough to taste, Marin did a thing she had not done in 18 months. She talked to the dead. She told Cole she was sorry and not sorry both, that she had found a place at last and that it was trying its best to kill her. And she talked to Walt, the grandfather she had met 4 times and listened to all year. And she asked him out loud in the roaring dark whether he had been right, whether the trees and the stubble and the grass would do what he had spent his whole life promising, or whether she had thrown the last of herself away on the faith of a man in a tin. The house did not answer. Only the wind answered, and the wind had been telling the same lie to that country for 90 years, that nothing holds, that everything blows away in the end. Maren sat in her grandfather's chair and held the wet cloth to her face and waited for the wind to be proven wrong. And when it lifted, when the light came creeping back and the wind laid down, and Maren went out onto the porch on legs that shook, she saw what Walt Coyle had spent his whole life trying to make people see. The country around her was changed. Up and down the section line, the bare-plowed fields of her neighbors had moved. Dwight Ferris's wheat ground, worked clean and black in the old way his father had taught him, had blown out in long fans, the topsoil scoured down to hardpan in places, piled 3 feet deep against the fence lines in others, drifts of dead dirt burying the bottom wire. Cody's place was worse. The dust had moved like water and taken the best of the soil with it. East, gone, the 10,000-year topsoil flown away in an afternoon, exactly as it had in 1934, because no one had learned, because the lesson had been written down and sealed in a tin and forgotten. But behind the shelter belt, in the calm that the long dark comb of trees had carved out of the killing wind, Maren's land lay still. The standing stubble had held. The cover crop, half dead from drought but still rooted, had held. The native grass on the worst ground had held the way grass holds, the way Walt had written that nothing a man plants can hold. There were drifts along her windward fence where the neighbor's soil had come to rest on her. A gift of stolen dirt the wind had carried in. But her own ground, her grandfather's ground, the ground everyone in the county had known was worthless and doomed, had not moved. It sat green and held and quiet in the lee of 100 living trees, an island, exactly as the diagrams in the notebook had promised, 60 years after a man had drawn them by lamplight and sealed them away. If you've been moved by how the line held, take a second to like this video, because what the neighbors did next is the whole reason any of it matters. They came the way the old folks had come, one at a time, with their boots still gray from their own ruined fields. Dwight Ferris was the first. He came on a Wednesday evening, 3 days after the duster, and he stood at the edge of Maren's held ground and looked at the shelter belt and the stand stubble and the grass that hadn't moved, and then he looked at his own land to the south, scoured and drifted, his year and a good measure of his soil gone with the wind. And Maren watched a hard, proud man carry something heavier than what his hands were holding. "I need you to tell me what you did here," he said. And it was not a question. It was a man asking why his neighbor's ground had held while his own gave way. Maren did not gloat. She had no gloat in her. "It wasn't me," she said. "It was him." She brought out the notebooks and set them on the plank table. "Sit down, Dwight. I'll pour you a coffee." He sat. He turned the first notebook over in his big cracked hands like it might break. "My granddad farmed alongside yours," he said. "He always said Walt Coyle let his place go to ruin, weeds and trees and grass where there ought to have been a crop. My granddad let it go to ruin the same way it just saved my farm," Maren said. She opened the notebook to the line from 1934 and turned it so he could read it. "Never let the ground go naked." Dwight read that twice. Then he looked out the window at his own land, scoured down to hardpan, and Maren watched something move across a hard, proud man's face. 90 years, he said quietly. "My family farmed this dirt 90 years, and the man who knew how to keep it was 2 miles down the road the whole time, and we never once asked him." He set the coffee down untouched. "Read me the rest of it," he said. So she did. She sat with Dwight Ferris at her grandfather's plank table until the light went out of the windows, and she read him the diagrams of the wind and the comb of trees and the zones of shelter. And Dwight, whose own grandfather had come up alongside Walt Coyle and chosen the plow, sat and listened to the voice of a dead man explain the thing his family had failed to learn for 90 years. Cody came 2 days after his uncle. He did not grin this time. He stood at the edge of Maren's held ground with his hat in his hands, a young man who had laughed at the trash in her fields and watched his own best soil fly to Kansas, and for a while he could not find anything to say at all. Then he said, "I owe you an apology, ma'am." And Maren told him he didn't, that nobody had owed her grandfather an apology either, and it had never been about that. She walked him along the shelter belt and showed him the gap she'd filled with green poles in the spring. Every one of them leafed out and living now, and she told him how to do it, 1.5 feet into the wet ground in March, and walk away, and trust it. "That's the hard part," she said. "The trusting. You set it and you can't see anything happening for the longest time, and you just have to believe it's rooting down where you can't watch. Cody looked at the young trees a long moment. My granddad knew your granddad, he said quietly. Chose the plow. I always heard Walt Coyle was a strange old man who let his fields go to weeds. He shook his head. Nobody told me he was right. That was the whole tragedy of the High Plains in a single sentence, Marin thought, and she did not say it because the young man had arrived at it on his own, and the notebooks had taught her that you let people get there themselves, and then you pour them another cup of coffee. She poured him one. He stayed till dark, asking questions, and he was the second farm after his uncle's to leave the stubble standing that fall. Others came, ranchers and dryland farmers from 4 counties, because word travels in an empty country, and what had happened behind Marin Tolliver's shelter belt was the kind of thing the High Plains had been waiting 90 years to be shown. The county extension agent drove out and walked the line with a measuring tape and a notebook of his own. Asking questions, Marin answered without impatience and without pride. She let them read the notebooks. She showed them how to set a cottonwood pole so it would root, push it 1.5 feet into the wet spring ground, and walk away and trust it. She showed them where to leave the grass and how to keep the ground clothed through the winter. Nobody laughed at the trash anymore. Nobody had anything left to laugh about. They stood on her held ground, serious and humbled, and they listened to a 61-year-old widow who had arrived in the county a year before with everything she owned in a 1998 Buick explain a thing that had been sitting in a tobacco tin behind a false buffle for half a century, waiting for someone to need it badly enough to find it. The following spring, 11 farms along the section line roads of Cimarron County left their stubble standing and sowed cover behind the harvest. The extension office ran a workshop on shelter belts and soil cover that drew people from across the panhandle and over the line into Texas and Kansas and Colorado, and Marin Tolliver, who did not consider herself a speaker, stood up in front of 200 people in a metal building in Boise City and read aloud, in a voice. A sound was as noun in the room, but her voice in the wind against the walls. 2 years after the duster, you could drive the section lines and see new shelter belts going in, young trees set in long dark rows across the wind, and stubble standing gold in fields that had been plowed black for 3 generations. The land was learning to hold, or rather, the people who worked it were learning, slowly, the way people always learn it, after the wind has risen once and the soil has been counted, that the old man in the tin had been right all along. Garrett Dunn's company pulled its operation out of the county within the year. The deep water they had counted on mining was not worth the fight once the people who lived over it understood what was being taken, and a community that had rediscovered its own memory was a harder thing to buy than scattered old folks alone in the wind. Caprock sold its assembled acres at a loss and moved south. Dunn had measured the worth of that country and the water under it and the dollars he could pull from the ground, and he had lost in the end to a dead man's tobacco tin and an old woman who would not sell, because he had never been able to see the thing that gave the place its real value. And you cannot take what you cannot even find. Marin did not get rich. The land did not make her rich, just as it had never made Walt rich. She made a living, a small one, off the wheat and a few cattle, and a great deal of fixing things for the families up and down the road, sewing machines and small engines and the occasional well pump, taking what they offered, and sometimes, more and more as the years went by, taking nothing at all. She had found in the 3rd notebook the list of names and the instruction that came after the hardest of them, do not collect, and she had understood it not as charity but as accounting, a way of keeping real the thing that mattered, and she had started a list of her own in the back of a fresh notebook, in her own hand beside her grandfather's, the same patient shorthand. Seed to the Garza family, their first year on the old Hudson place. A truck fixed for the young couple out past Keys, do not collect. The list grew slowly, the way such lists should. There was a young woman in the 3rd year who came to the gate in a car that was failing, with 2 small children in the back seat and the particular stillness in her face that Marin had seen once in a gas station mirror in Liberal, Kansas, the look of someone carrying more than she could say. She had heard there was an old woman out on the Coyle place who might know of work, or a room. Marin had a room. She had the front room with the daybed, or the Alpon room where the Vale family had once spent 4 months in the worst year of the world, and she gave it to them, and asked nothing, and wrote nothing down for them to see, though that night, by lamplight, in the back of her notebook beside her grandfather's accounts, she set down their names. The young mother's name was Renata Garza, and she had left a bad situation up in Garden City with $100, the 2 children, and a car with a slipping transmission, and she had the look, those first weeks, of someone braced for the favor to turn into a bill. Marin knew that look from the inside. She did not rush it. She let Renata cook in her kitchen and carry water to the seedlings and learn the work, and slowly, the way frightened things come in out of the cold, the young woman stopped flinching at kindness. One evening that winter, Renata asked her plainly, why? Why the room? Why the food? Why none of it written on any bill she'd ever be handed? Marin gave the only answer there was. Somebody did it for my grandfather's neighbors, she said, and he did it for them, and now I'm doing it for you. There's no trick in it. When you're on your feet, you'll do it for somebody else, and that's how it's paid. Renata learned to set a cottonwood pole that spring, and to keep the ground from going naked, and the thing Marin had come all that way to learn herself, which was that a place will hold you if you hold it. In the spring she found her feet and moved on to a place of her own up the road, and the loop that Walt Coyle had started in 1936 turned over one more time, the way it was built to do. The extension office ran a workshop on shelter belts and soil cover, that spring that drew people from across the Panhandle and over the line into Texas and Kansas and Colorado, and they asked Marin to speak, and she did not want to, and she did it anyway. She stood up in front of 200 people in a metal building in Boise City, a small gray-haired woman in a clean-pressed shirt, and she did not give a speech because she had no speeches in her. She read aloud in a steady voice from her grandfather's notebooks. She read the line from 1934, "Never let the ground go naked." She read the diagram of the wind and the comb of trees. And then, because it seemed to her the truest thing in all 4 notebooks, she read the long entry about the Vales, the front room standing empty, which was a lie, and the barn loft, which was nearly true, and a man does not charge another man for being alive. There was not a sound in the room but her voice and the wind against the walls. When she finished and sat down, an old rancher in the 3rd row, a hard-weathered man who had buried 2 droughts and a wife, was wiping his eyes with the back of his hand and not caring who saw. They had come to learn how to keep their soil from blowing away. They had learned that, and something else besides, the thing Walt had hidden in the tin under the soil wisdom, which was that the two were never really separate, that a country and the people in it hold together or wash away together, and that the holding is always, always done the same way, by what you are willing to leave covered for someone you may never meet. Marin grew old on that land. She kept the shelter belt and filled its gaps as the old trees died, pushing green poles into the wet spring earth and walking away and trusting them, the way her grandfather had trusted her without ever knowing she would come. She kept the notebooks on a shelf above the cook stove, his 4 and her growing 5th, and she read in them on winter nights, and she added to them. The land remembers things, if you give it room to. The people who work it can learn to remember too, but usually only after the wind has risen once, and the loss has been counted, and someone patient enough to have been listening all along shows them where the line held. Marin Tolliver had arrived in Cimarron County, a widow with $43.12 to her name, owning nothing, belonging nowhere, an old woman everyone had quietly decided was finished. She had inherited a piece of ground that a lawyer told her was worth less than the debt against it. And in a tobacco tin behind a false panel, sealed away by a man who had been dead for 30 years, she had found the only kind of wealth that had ever lasted out on those high, dry plains. It was not the money. It was not the water under the ground. It was the knowledge of how to keep a thing alive in a country that wanted to blow it away, and the record of a quiet life spent keeping other people alive too, and the simple unkillable idea that what you leave covered holds. She had set out only to keep a place to stand. In the end, she had given a whole county back its memory and taught it. One ruined field at a time, the thing her grandfather had written in the first hard winter and every winter after, until it stopped being a sentence and became the truth the wind itself confirmed. Never let the ground go naked, the line held, and Marin Tolliver, who had once owned nothing in the world, lived out her years as the richest woman in Cimarron County in every way that the wind could not carry off. So here is what an old woman, a dead man's notebooks, and one strip of grass that refused to blow away can teach us, if we are willing to learn it before the wind rises. A legacy is never the money. It was not the water under the ground, which a man in a clean truck could measure and covet and never truly own. The only inheritance that outlasts a life is the knowledge of how to keep a thing alive, and the record of the kindness you spent on people who could never pay you back. That is the wealth the wind cannot carry off. And there is a second lesson, quieter than the first, that Marin learned the hard way in 11 days in a cold car. Pride kept secret is the most expensive thing a person can own. Cole Tolliver carried his burden alone, all the way to a hospital bed because he could not bear to be helped, and it crushed 2 people instead of 1. Letting others carry the load with you is not weakness. It is the same courage it takes to push a green pole into the ground in March and walk away and trust that it is rooting where you cannot see. So cover your ground. Whatever your ground is, your work, your family, the people the world has taught you to overlook, do not leave it naked to the wind for the sake of one clean season. Keep it covered. Let it hold. And when the storm has passed and your land is the only thing left standing, do what Walt Coyle did and what his granddaughter did after him. Don't keep the secret of how you survived. Read it out loud at the plank table to the neighbor who once laughed at you, and pour him another cup of coffee, and let the line you held become the line that holds him too. The land remembers. So do the people, in the end, usually only after the wind has risen once and the loss has been counted. But it is never too late to be the one who was paying attention all along.